dollar, that makes it very hard for people who are planning travel, makes it very hard for businesses that set up operations across borders, make it very hard for people who are planning export contracts. And so China has gone with a very slow adjustment upward of its currency. And that's a nice thing. Well, so what should the U.S. be trying to do in terms of its relationships with China? I think pointing fingers is not particularly helpful, and the hope is that we want long-run engagement, that the U.S. and China are very important powers in the Pacific and certainly in the world, and there's room for conflict. I mean, both are military powers, and Lord help us if that ever came into conflict. Paul Krugman, the recent Nobel Prize winner, talks about how countries really are not competitors, that firms are competitors. But the countries aren't. That countries are sort of each other's customers, and that we want good relationships. We want China to develop and have good relationships with us. To sort out this Korean problem that we both face, to sort out Russia is certainly not perhaps moved the way either the U.S. or China would have hoped to have seen it move. And certainly in terms of, our contributions to world policy, or world development, world policies. When you think about the countries that have been important for the U.S. in the last 100 years, I would say China has not been tremendously powerful or important for us, except in terms of this sort of trade, in terms of labor-intensive goods, and in terms of flows of people into our markets. But that you think about what countries have been important for the U.S. in the last 100 years. Certainly Germany, certainly England, certainly Japan. And why have they been so important for us? Because they've given us a lot of great ideas. That our chemical industry, our automobile industry, our computer industries, they wouldn't be nearly where they were or where they are today without the contributions of these countries. And that over the last 100 years, China has, I think, done very little for U.S. growth in terms of a flow of ideas. And thinking back over long periods of history, that the flow is often the other direction. You can think about paper, gunpowder, certainly a lot of metallurgy, certainly a lot of food issues. That gunpowder certainly. That China's intellectual contributions to the world were immense in the past, and I think in the near future will also be immense. That for a long time, Korea and Japan were not making great contributions to sort of progress in terms of intellectual matters, and that's certainly not the case today. And so hopefully, China will return to leading in terms of where we get the great ideas for how to make everything better, more efficient. Where the new technologies, new sort of literary and other ideas will come from. The other sort of big economic issue that the U.S. has with China is environmental issues. That Europe has become very serious about the problems that we've put on the world's climate, and certainly in terms of CO2 and other greenhouse gas accumulation. And the countries that are really lagging behind Europe, and man, do I hate to see the U.S. lag behind Europe in anything, but that sort of owning up to the amount of CO2 we're putting out in the atmosphere. And certainly India and Brazil and other countries have to face up to this, but the two biggest polluters that really haven't made major steps toward fixing these problems are the U.S. and China. And it's hard to imagine any agreement coming forward without both countries really committing themselves to something. And it's hard for me to see how this will be worked out. I mean, I think it's certainly a problem of economics, it's certainly a problem of engineering, it's certainly a problem of political science. That, I liken this to a buffet. That the problem with CO2 in the atmosphere, it's certainly emissions, but it's also total accumulation. And where has all the CO2 come from? Well, it's come from basically the Industrial Revolution. That the human contribution to it got very, really took off in the Industrial Revolution. We started burning tremendous amounts of coal, and the industrialized countries were contributing the most for the longest. And it's kind of like there was a buffet laid out, and China and India and Brazil get to the buffet, and there's not that much food left. And you see, the U.S. and Germany and England, shoveling it in, and China and India rush to the buffet. And the country of been there a while. I was like, wait a minute. There's not that much food left. We better at this point get very careful about rationing out what little food is left. And you can imagine the latecomers saying, well, that's not quite how we see it. We see it as you guys have eaten a lot and become very large or very prosperous for it. And now it's our time to use up some of this resource, which is the atmosphere's ability to absorb carbon. And I can't really see anything wrong with that argument. That sort of having countries go into an agreement about limiting emissions as sort of equals, as sort of starting from the same point, is crazy, and that that really seems like it's going to have to be some sort of agreement where the wealthy countries buy off the poor countries, where the wealthy countries say, here are the contributions we're going to make toward climate change. We're going to do these things ourselves in terms of cutting our emissions. In addition, we're going to put forth resources, technology, and straight-up payments to pay poor countries not to shift to heavy coal burning or other sort of major sources of greenhouse gases. And yeah, you look to the future, who's going to be burning the most coal, who's building most plants? It's China. And carbon put in the atmosphere, it looks like the impact of that sort of lasts like 1,000 years. And so, the damage we've done is going to be, well, that's there, and it's going to be causing trouble for the next 1,000 years. And at this point, we're just sort of in the point of harm mitigation, so thinking about how much the future harm is going to come, can we scale back? And it's going to really depend on the U.S. getting serious about making contributions and negotiating with China about sort of finding ways that China can achieve the continued growth that China has been enjoying and hopes to enjoy in the future, but in ways that will not put quite so much CO2 in the atmosphere. And so we've got these sort of short-run problems of U.S. fiscal and trade imbalances, matching with China's, and that causing some tensions. But those are small issues, and we've got these longer-term issues of sort of U.S. and China sharing spheres of influence here, areas of sort of potential military conflict, and certainly finding ways of negotiating a balance in terms of climate change. And these long-term issues, the important ones, these short-term issues, the things that Treasury Secretary Geithner is complaining about, oh, these are just silly. And I worry that harsh words there distract us from making real progress on the important issues. Anyway, that's my piece for today, and I look forward to Professor Shih's piece.
Thank you, Professor. Our second speaker, Professor Victor Shih, received his doctorate in Harvard in government from Harvard University, where he researched on the banking sector reforms in China, with the support of the Jacob K. Javits Fellowship and the Fulbright Fellowship. Professor Shih is also leading academics on the study of Chinese politics, and he will be speaking about the major challenges facing China under President Obama's leadership and possible solutions. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Shih.
Thank you, Stephen and ChinaForesee, for organizing this event, and for Mark for setting it up also nicely. And you raised a very interesting issue. What idea? Oh, I think the mic just went out somehow. Or is it still going? Oh, anyway, what ideas has China contributed to the world? Well, one idea is a nationalized banking system, endless moral hazard. Those ideas certainly that the Chinese economy has been a model for the U.S. economy. Oh, and also state-owned enterprises in the form of GM and Ford these days. So it looks like this year that Chinese